Top of the morning to you and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay. The headlines: at least 2 injured in nighttime Russian missile attack on Ukraine's Donetsk town. Russia's President Vladimir Putin expects new Sarmat nuclear missile for deployment soon. Plus, Wagner chief accuses Moscow of misleading Russians over Ukraine war. Thank you for joining us. At least 2 civilians are injured after a Russian missile attack on a town in Ukraine's Donetsk region last night. A whistling sound like a rocket engine was heard, followed by a powerful explosion that shook walls. Pavlovsk residents Natasha and Alexander, bloodied from the incident and speaking from an ambulance, say the missile hit their home while they were inside. The windows of their neighbor's house were blown out. Inside was an elderly resident living close to a wide crater left by the blast. Visibly shaken and gasping for air, he picked through the debris in his badly damaged home. Neighbors stood outside. Some sobbed, others tried to calm frightened children. Russia-appointed Governor Kherson says the Ukrainian forces have carried out a missile strike on a bridge linking the mainland to Crimea. Now, Vladimir Saldo says the bridge which links Kherson and Crimea was likely to have been attacked by Storm Shadow missiles, adding that traffic had been diverted to a different route. No casualties have been reported. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky claims that forces in the south are moving forward while troops in the east are holding off Russian attacks. Ukraine has said it's reclaimed 8 villages so far in its long-awaited counteroffensive. These will be its first substantial gains on the battlefield in 7 months. But after a flurry of early gains, Kiev has claimed to have captured only 1 additional village over the past week, the hamlet of Piatykatsky, and Ukrainian forces so far have yet to push their way to the main defensive lines that Russia has had months to prepare. Kiev is believed to have set aside 12 brigades of thousands of troops each, most of which have yet to join the fight. Meanwhile, Russian President Vladimir Putin, in remarks shown on Russian state television, said that Moscow is observing a lull in Ukraine's counteroffensive and that Kiev has suffered heavy losses in attacks in the south, both in personnel and equipment. His comments came as Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said his army's progress was slower than desired, but that Kiev would not be pressured into rushing it. President Putin has begun speaking with increasing frequency about the battlefield situation, perhaps reflecting the fact that the 16-month-old conflict has reached a critical moment with the launch of Ukraine's long-expected push. But he said that Ukraine's offensive potential has not yet been exhausted. There are also reserves that the enemy is thinking about where and how to introduce. He, however, boasts that the Ukrainian forces have no chance. For the Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, he has been harping on the necessity to move towards real projects for the reconstruction of Ukraine. Addressing the Ukraine Recovery Conference in London via video link, President Zelensky said he wants to see concrete things from them and that Ukraine will present those needs to donors at the conference. The Ukrainian president said the more targeted help in real projects will spur growth in an economy, he said, had moved far away from the oligarchic model of Ukraine's immediate post-Soviet era. Britain, the United States, and the European Union on Wednesday pledged billions of dollars in additional help to Ukraine, which said it needed the extra capital, as well as commitment to specific projects to not only recover, but to develop into a powerful member of the Western world. Ukraine's Prime Minister, Denis Shmyhal, told the conference that Kyiv was hoping for more than $6 billion from the event.
At this conference, we must move from vision to agreements and from agreements to real projects. There is a Ukrainian delegation in London that will present concrete things that we propose to do together.
As Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky now to the Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, who told the graduating military academy students on Wednesday that the collective West is waging a real war against Russia. Speaking alongside President Vladimir Putin at an event in the Kremlin, Shoigu added that the Russian military would do everything to ensure the security of the country. Also speaking in London, German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock cautioned that Ukraine must end 30 years of nepotism and corruption to join the EU. She was speaking on the sidelines of the Ukraine Reconstruction Conference. She admitted that the country has already made progress in reform, especially in the areas of free media and the rule of law, but added that further progress is needed. Kiev Mayor Vitaly Klitschko on Wednesday is accusing opponents of waging a campaign to discredit him and force him out of office, following the widening of a rift with Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky. The former boxing champion's political future is uncertain after a public outcry over the death of 3 people locked out of an air raid shelter during a Russian attack on Kiev this month. An audit ordered by President Zelensky found only 15% of Kiev's 4,655 bomb shelters are suitable and only 44% are freely accessible. Now, prosecutors served a formal notice of suspicion to a senior Kiev security official accused of mismanagement on Tuesday. Mr. Klitschko posted a video message on the Telegram messaging app in which he appeared to criticize investigations over the situation with the shelters, decrying endless searches were making it hard to run the capital efficiently. He criticized the prosecutor's decision to put the head of Kiev's Municipal Department for Security under house arrest following the audit and said it was too early for political battles while Ukraine was still fighting Russian forces. Mr. Klitschko, now in his 9th year as mayor, was seen as one of Zelensky's highest-profile opponents before Russia began its war in Ukraine last year. They had a public spat in November when President Zelensky accused Mr. Klitschko of doing a poor job setting up emergency shelters to help people with power and heat. After the bomb shelter incident on June the 1st, Klitschko said he bore some responsibility, but that others were to blame, especially appointees of the president. Now, the Russian president, Vladimir Putin, says his generation of Sarmat, his new generation, that is, of Sarmat intercontinental ballistic missiles, which are capable of carrying 10 or more nuclear warheads, will soon be deployed for combat duty. In a speech to new graduates of military academies, President Putin stressed the importance of Russia's triad of nuclear forces that can be launched from land, sea, or air. The most important task here, in his words, is the development of the nuclear triad, which is a key guarantee of Russia's military security and global stability. The chief of mercenary group Wagner, Prigozhin, has accused Moscow's top brass of deceiving Russians about the course of Ukraine's offensive and pointed to Kyiv's progress on the battlefield. Yevgeny Prigozhin, whose forces had for months led an assault for towns in eastern Ukraine, including Bakhmut, accused the defense ministry of not telling the truth and losing territory to Ukrainian troops. Speaking in an audio message released by his spokesperson, he says a number of villages, including Pyatikatki, have been lost, pointing to a lack of arms and ammunition. A United Nations official is concerned that the mines dislodged, I should say, by the floodwaters from Kakhovka Dam in Ukraine could float downstream and reach as far as beaches on the Black Sea. Head of the UN Mine Action with the United Nations Development Programme in Ukraine, Paul Heslop, told reporters in Geneva that the PMF-1 mines, also known as butterfly mines, are light enough to float a vast distance. The collapse of the Russian-held dam on June the 6th unleashed floodwaters across southern Ukraine and Russian-occupied areas of the Kherson region, killing more than 50 people and destroying homes and farmland. Ukraine's environment minister says the dam's collapse has caused 1.2 billion euros in damage.
I would not be surprised to see that those mines have either got down as far as the sea, or over the coming months, as the water is continuing to flow, will be transported down there. The PFM1, which is the butterfly mine, is a very small, hermetically sealed plastic mine filled with liquid explosives, which is probably less dense than water. So I would think they would like to float down the river, and although I've never conducted trials, I'm sure that they have been dispersed in different places. So yes, unfortunately, we could see anti-personnel pressure mines washing up on beaches around the Black Sea. I would say over time spreading out from the Danube, from the delta of that particular river, and making their way along the coast. So it's not great. Now, obviously, a 10-kilo anti-tank mine is not going to go the same distance as a 50, 60-gram anti-personnel mine. So yes, there will be contamination. There will be some in the sea. There will be some in the rivers. How we deal with that? It's another one to add to the list of problems to solve. But, I mean, we're talking about almost a biblical disaster, and that's before you throw in the mine equation. Now, again, we don't know what we don't know. We do know that there was widespread use of mines on that south bank, obviously to prevent an attack across the river. We do know that the south bank was lower than the north bank, so was more affected by the floods. And so we can only, I can only draw the conclusion that a number of explosive devices, be they UXO or mines and anti-personnel mines, will have been washed downriver.
Joining us on the program this morning is Senior Fellow, Forum of Trans-Regional Studies and Senior Researcher, National Academy of Science, Ukraine, Professor Victoria Serida, speaking to us from Berlin in Germany. Professor, Доброго ранку, привіт, and welcome to the program.
Good morning.
And that's where I'd like to begin, the culture index, before we get to the meat of the matter and the counteroffensive and the issue concerning the mines and what Putin and Zelensky have said yesterday. For the culture index, language speaks to culture. Nothing does so better than that. And a 2022 study conducted called the Language Report of 2022 showed that 1.3 million people around the world began to learn Ukrainian language from last year. Now, tell us how that has been perceived across Ukraine. And are you experiencing in Berlin that more people want to learn the Ukrainian language? Obviously, these people in solidarity with the Ukrainian people because of the Russian invasion.
Yes, I think we don't know which parts of the globe people started learning more Ukrainian, but I guess in many cases this would be the countries with the highest concentration of Ukrainian displaced, which went cross-border, for example, to Germany. And then we have in Germany close to 1 million people with approximately 1/3 of this population has kids who attend schools. And in German schools, you have to have 2 international languages, and the second language could be, for example, Ukrainian, if municipality decides. And if you have more than 10 persons in one school who would opt for this language. So in this case, there is a huge shortage of Ukrainian language teachers in Germany currently who could offer Ukrainian language to Ukrainian pupils. Very similar situation is in Poland, where we have almost closer to 2 million people with kids. And languages are much closer. So again, a lot of efforts are done to help Ukrainian pupils to acquire new language skills, but also to cater to the Ukrainian knowledge.
And this obviously speaks of the displacements that you've mentioned. That leads me to a paper that you presented sometime in March, I believe, which you called the Feminized Forced Migration of People to Poland and Germany. What did you mean in this paper? What does it encapsulate?
So if we look at the demographics of displacements from war zones from other parts of the globe, typically this would be approximately 2/3 young male who are escaping or fleeing from the possible conscription or participation in military activities. In Ukraine, because of the law, men are not between 18 and 60 are not allowed to leave the country. So if we look at the demographics, they show absolute reversal of this case. So in many countries, if we look, depending of course on the country where people are traveling, but in majority of countries we would have 80% of women and only smaller share of male persons who are over 60, obviously, or there are some few exceptions as well, but in majority of cases, these are women with kids. That's why now the needs of this group is very different from the previous waves of displacement linked to the war. And this is important to understand to be able again to cater to those needs.
And this displacement obviously is because of the conflict, which in this incident in Kiev, where these three people were trying to gain access to a bomb raid shelter and they couldn't. As a consequence, they died, for which reason Vitaly Klitschko seems to be under fire. As far as 2 weeks ago, Professor, or even 3 weeks ago, some Ukrainian officials had drawn attention to the fact that these bomb shelters were only 44% operational and only 15% suitable for operations. How come something so obviously in dire need of was not given enough attention this late in the war?
I guess this is the case of lower level, lower ranks bureaucracy, and when people are not really caring or paying attention, and this case was made very clear, and it was made a showcase for the whole country when then all bomb shelters were inspected. And they discovered that very horrendous reality when 2/3 of shelters only were ready for accepting people. And also there were many cases where people were just locking them. So even if they are ready, but the person who is responsible was not always there, like in case you mentioned. And I think this is important to follow up this procedure in other cities.
Shouldn't this be, tell us if you know what the law is. Does this fall under the purview of the municipals or the federal government? Shouldn't the federal government be in charge of the safety of the people because of for the availability of the bomb shelters because of they're in a state of war?
Ukraine went through the process of decentralization, and a lot of power was shared with the local governments. And in this case, this is the case when local governments, city governments, or smaller communities governments are responsible for those bomb shelters. We have also to keep in mind that it depends on the people, because if people take it easy in certain circumstances and do not demand that these bomb shelters should be up to standards, then it takes time to discover what is the reality.
Okay, it's clearly something that needs to be sorted out quickly. But for the counteroffensive itself, for which President Zelensky says that the progress is slower than desired, but he'd not be rushed into anything. To quote him, he said, "It's not a Hollywood movie where people expect something to happen overnight." But in the same breath, President Putin says that the counteroffensive is experiencing a lull. What's your estimation of how things stand with the counteroffensive?
I also always thought that it will be slow, first of all, because on all these territories there are Ukrainian citizens. And it's extremely difficult to take villages or cities and have a military operations if you have Ukrainian citizens still living there. And in many cases, Russian troops are actually using those civilians as shields against the active progress. And another issue which is mentioned by at different levels, including UN, that actually right now Ukraine is the biggest territory in the world with mines. And this again creates the disaster not only to the troops, to their advance, but in reality to the civilians, because as soon as front line passes, then these civilians are extremely endangered. It takes months or sometimes even a year to find all of them and make sure that these spaces are not dangerous any longer. And we again just heard that because of the Kakhovka dam explosion, a lot of explosives went with the flood, and we don't know where they're located or where they might turn to be in the nearest months.
So the dislodgement of the mines is also affecting the counteroffensive, you say, and you also say that the Russian soldiers are using people as human shields. Has this been verified?
Yes. So in certain villages, for example, they are not allowed to move, or they do not have enough humanitarian corridors to move from those spaces. Or as we saw, for example, again with situation with Kakhovka floods, when they are still not letting in not even Ukrainian government, but UN and Red Cross international organizations to help to evacuate those who were affected on their side.
Professor, as this is going on in the last few, yesterday, I think it's ending today or thereabouts, the Ukraine Recovery Conference in London. Before you can say Blinken or blink, the U.S. Secretary of State has offered another $1.something billion in aid to Ukraine. Things seem to be going well on that front for recovery. Could you give us your view of how this Ukraine Recovery Conference will affect post-conflict Ukraine? And for those who think that more should be done in the way of mediation, is this putting the cart before the horse? Should the UK and other countries also be thinking about having a conference for mediation? It seems that they've given up, at least for the present moment, on bringing the two parties to the table. And all they're talking about is how Ukraine will defend themselves and continue the war for a long term. If you listen to NATO, if you listen to the EU, long-term assistance, multi-year assistance, nobody wants to hear that in Ukraine. Nobody wants the war to go on for years and years. So that, and they're talking about recovery. What about mediation? What about a conference to bring the people together, regardless of how the previous attempts have failed?
I think these are two parallel processes, and both are extremely needed for the country. But what we saw with attempts of mediation, they all failed, even at the lower scale. We discussed a few months ago, for example, about the small step things, such as, for example, grain deal. And what we observed, that grain deal, despite it was negotiated, there were agreements reached, Ukrainian grain is not being shipped, and this creates a crisis in other parts of the world and raises prices for the food. And I think this shows how little can be done even within very small and very urgent spheres. So in this case, if we are talking about the peace negotiations, exactly the day when the delegation was in Ukraine, in Kyiv, the city was shelled again, and they had to go to the shelters. So how can you talk about peace even if during the visits of peace negotiating groups there are shellings, and these shellings are constant. Every night, big Ukrainian cities are shelled by Russian missiles.
I see your point. Finally, Professor, there are vulnerable groups that remain in Ukraine. When I say vulnerable groups, I mean the demographics of children and the youth and the elderly, the infirm, those who are physically challenged, who could not leave the country and remain in Ukraine. Could you tell us how this is being handled by the government to deflect the trauma that the war is causing from the children? And also, could you speak to the point of teenagers in Ukraine who are from the ages of 13 to 18? You mentioned that from 18 upwards, the people young men are not allowed to leave Ukraine. But there's this group that may be not ignored, but neglected because of their demographic. The teenagers, they're too young to be called children. They're not 10, 9 years old. They're too young to be called adults, I beg your pardon. They're not 20 years old. They're too old to be called children. So they're in the middle. And they are the ones on social media, they're the ones with their phones, and they're the ones obviously really traumatized by the war. Can you tell us if the government is doing anything by way of psychological or physiological health interventions to help these teenagers in Ukraine get through this war?
I'm not a specialist, but I know of initiatives. First of all, I know that the First Lady has a special fund which exactly is aiming mental health, and specifically a part of it is dealing with mental health of youth. The issue is that in Ukraine we have this post-Soviet trauma with psychology, which was used by during the Soviet Union to fight dissidents. And many people of middle or older age, they don't like to actually, they have a kind of suspicion, very strong suspicion towards mental health because of this. And
Yes.
of course, if elderly are suspicious, they don't believe that this is needed to teenagers. But there are a lot of online platforms where teenagers can connect, and even if they're adults helping them, whatever. However, we should keep in mind that in majority of cases, those who are traveling abroad exactly are traveling for the reason to take kids out of the country. And we have many cases when, for example, mothers would return to the country, to their husbands, but elderly will stay with teenagers outside of the country, in Poland or in other countries, for the sake of psychological, mental health and safety of those teenagers. And of course, if they are outside of the country, there are a lot of programs, again, directed to mental health of teenagers. But all our surveys are showing that if you ask about the pressing needs, psychological help would be the lowest point in answers.
We hope that these issues are really attended to for the sake of both parties, especially the Ukrainians, and this war is brought to some sort of conclusion. Thank you so much for your insights and your contribution this morning, Professor Victoria Sarida, who joined us from Berlin, the Senior Fellow, Forum of Trans-Regional Studies and Senior Researcher, National Academy of Science in Ukraine. Thank you for being a part of the program this morning.
Thank you.
Still ahead, 11th EU sanctions package against Russia to target sanctions evasion. Do join us again. Welcome back to our coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. The Russian-occupied Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in Ukraine plans to resume pumping water from what remains of the reservoir behind a nearby dam that burst 2 weeks ago. The International Atomic Energy Agency said last week that it was unclear whether it will be possible to pump water from the reservoir to cool reactors and spent fuel at Europe's biggest nuclear plant, given how much the reservoir's water level has fallen. Now, the plant can fall back on other water sources, including a cooling pond that the IAEA says has months of water supplies in it. But whatever can be pumped from the reservoir should buy more time before stocks have to be replenished. Now let's turn our attention to the Black Sea grain export, where the Kremlin has restated its position that there's no grounds to extend the deal. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said that the Turkish and United Nations brokered accord was not being properly implemented. He adds that the United Nations have been forced to acknowledge that, unfortunately, they are not managing to exert the necessary influence on the countries of the collective West in order to fulfill this Russian part of the agreement. He was referring to a list of Russian demands, including for the removal of what Moscow says are obstacles to the export of its own grain and fertilizers. Now I would like to speak with Dr. Dapo Thomas, expert on international relations theory, Lagos State University, joining us virtually from Lagos, southwest Nigeria. It's good to have you on the program this morning.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Good morning, Olumide.
Good morning, sir. Let's begin from these Sarmat missiles that Vladimir Putin says will be operational soon for use. This is coming on the heels of insinuations by Sergei Shoigu, the defense minister for Russia, that the Ukrainians plan to attack Crimea. Apparently, there may be some truth to that, but it appears that some area linking a bridge to Crimea was attacked by what they say are Storm Shadow missiles. And these French and British-made missiles, if put to use, according to Russia, will bring the Great Britain and America into the war. Now, it's gone beyond saber rattling and beyond bluffing. It seems to me, or it seems to observers, that the escalation continues. Your thoughts?
Now, you want to know whether the war will escalate or... Well, there is no doubt about it, that in a very short period, I don't foresee... Well, depending on how Putin manages it, I don't foresee the West and Ukraine escalating the war on their own part. They have been managing it for almost 1.5 years now, you know, and they have been managing it well to make sure that it does not escalate. Even when Ukraine and the Russian nationalists were attacking some part of Russia, particularly the Kremlin, they still manage it in a way that it will not escalate. But definitely the person that is likely to escalate the war is Putin. Why? Because number one is pride. He doesn't want to lose this war, and he's ready to invest everything into winning this war. But I do not see the possibility of Russia winning this war for so many reasons. Number one, this is not a war that, I mean, it is not only Ukraine you are fighting a superpower, and then you are fighting other powers, you know, major powers and then possibly some medium powers. And these powers would not like to be disgraced as well. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is that it has never happened. There is no precedent for what he is doing since 1945, when the United Nations forbids any nation from carrying out acts of aggression against another nation, that the sovereignty and territoriality of every nation is sacrosanct. So for those two reasons, for now, I do not see how Putin will win this war. But whether it can escalate, yes. One, if there is any error of firing of missiles, which now happen to land in the territory of any of the members of NATO, then there is going to be automatic retaliation, and then there will be automatic escalation also. Then secondly, if he uses nuclear, any form of nuclear at all, they are monitoring all the missiles he's using. If he's using any missile that is packaged with nuclear, in whatever form, uranium, plutonium, whatever, then it's likely that NATO will come in. Because when you use nuclear, there is a possibility of it getting to Latvia, Estonia, Finland, and Poland. And this will not be tolerated. And those are the reasons I think he will not allow the war to escalate. So, but he has already positioned or deployed what you can call tactical nuclear missile to Belarus. And Belarus is also trying, in fact, Belarus is removing or changing its constitution to remove the aspect of non-nuclear profiling. No? So let's see how it goes. But definitely they have to manage this very well. I do not see how this war will continue like this without the possibility of it escalating beyond Ukraine.
Now, when you say that, it brings to mind how JFK, the famed United States President, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, was commended for the way he avoided, or he was said to have tried his best and did avoid nuclear conflict involving the Russians, how he handled diplomatic relations with Russia in the era of the Cold War, and later on how Vietnam turned out to be a sore point with the United States that led Richard Nixon and LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson before him to look for a way of pulling out of Vietnam while saving face. Now, do you see this situation with Ukraine as being another Vietnam for Russia?
Of course. Unfortunately, this Putin, I've read so much about him. I have seen him as somebody with ego, and he has one ambition and one vision. And the vision is to continue, is to restore the lost glory, what he considers to be the lost glory of Soviet Union. He has that mind that he still has to bring in some of these nations that left the Union. And then he wants to use force in whatever way. He wants to use force and he wants to use diplomacy. Belarus and all these Kazakhstan and all of them, he has them. But Georgia, Chechnya, and Ukraine, he wants to use force to bring them back into Russia. And this is why I feel that he is going all out for this war. The only thing that can happen to Putin is for them to remove, is for the Russians themselves or possibly some of his men to remove him. But for as long as he's there, he's going to be there. He doesn't mind if this war. Don't forget, the Vietnam you are talking about took 25 years, more than 25 years, before the US withdrew. And so he doesn't mind. I think he has a possibility now. He has another period that will. He has already extended this period in the Constitution. So he can go for 80-something years now. Age. But now he can. When he's going, it's about 2036. That's in the first instance. So he doesn't care how long it lasts. For as long as he achieves his objective, that is one objective that he has. And the only objective he has is that he wants to make sure that he wins this war, but it's not likely. So that is going to be a Vietnam for him. Obviously, it's going to be a Vietnam. The only thing that can happen, like I said, is that if he's edged out, if he's removed from power, then the new person can now call for a kind of truce. You understand? It can call for a kind of truce, and that will be it. That will be it. For the management of the nuclear in 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis you are talking about. Yes, JFK, Kennedy managed it very well. by ensuring that the thing did not result into war. And then the Russians too. You know, Khrushchev was very tactical about it because he already knew the Americans had identified where the missiles were fired. So he had no other way out than to remove the missiles, than to dismantle the missiles. Because once your enemy, once your adversary already knows the location of your missiles, then there is opportunity of eating directly at that particular warehouse or anywhere you have already put your missiles. So it wasn't wise for them to continue debating or discussing that kind of thing with US. They have already identified where because the Russians were denying, you know. So give or take, I see this, I don't know what intervention the United Nations is going to play. Unfortunately, with the gaffe that Biden made at the weekend when he was talking about, when he was calling Xi a dictator, I was thinking when Blinken went to Russia, went to China, I was thinking there was a game going on between US and China. But definitely China has its own game. And I know that the game is not to support Russia or to empower Russia or to make Russia come out of this war, another power. China also enjoys the kind of publicity and the kind of limelight that, the kind of publicity and something that is having now. They are happy that they are the people, they are the only nation contending with US now, competing with US. So they want to get Russia out. So they want Russia to deplete the resources, its own conventional resources, armaments. So for as long as that is happening, the new Cold War will set in between China and the US. And then Russia is out. Russia, don't forget, Russia was involved in the Cold War. But now it's going to. So they are just playing some kind of game which is going to leave Russia completely out of the power block in the international system.
Wow, that's intriguing. Dr. Thomas, finally and very quickly, President Putin, to be fair, says, we don't know whether he's going to make good on that assertion, that he will not run for office again in 2024, next year when his term expires. To the Russian recovery, the Ukrainian recovery conference in London, President Volodymyr Zelensky, who joined via video link, said something that I think was very smart to say. He began to color the efforts in Ukraine as a fight for freedom. So in other words, he was encouraging the partners of Ukraine and the participants in the conference and saying to them that a support for Ukraine is a support for freedom. And you can take that to mean that if you don't support Ukraine, you do not support freedom around the world. So conceptualizing freedom and making it tantamount to the victory of Ukraine over Russia was a very smart thing for Zelensky to do at this Ukraine Recovery Conference in London. But where does that leave Russia, who say at the outset of this war, all they wanted was, don't come to our borders with NATO. You're on our border, we don't want NATO there. Don't ill-treat people sympathetic to the Russian cause living in Ukraine in a poor manner, which they accuse the Ukrainian authorities of going after Russian elements in Ukraine and victimizing them. Those are some of the issues that the Russians have. Is it fair to say that a fight for Ukraine is a fight for freedom, and Russia has nothing in the way of a point to make in NATO accepting Ukraine as their member?
Well, there's what they call sphere of influence. That is, you must respect your opponent, or maybe you must respect the areas of influence of the other superpower. That is, since Russia and Ukraine share borders and everything, they don't expect US or NATO to come and establish any kind of base, whether military, whether naval, whether anything. They don't expect them to come and establish it at their doorstep, around that place. But unfortunately, you have to manage this diplomatically. It is not through military action. These people, NATO and US that you are talking about, they are not people you can bully. And then, so when you manage it very well, it will come in your favor. Unfortunately for Russia now, You are saying that you feel, I mean, there is an existential threat as a result of Ukraine joining in NATO. Unfortunately for Russia, Finland has already joined NATO. So if you take away Ukraine, and then Finland is there. Finland is fully there now. And then Sweden, very soon, because they are talking to Turkey. So very soon, Sweden will join. So you wanted to remove, or you wanted to stop one country from joining NATO. Now you have two nations joining midstream. Moldova is still there. Georgia is still there. Their applications are still pending. And then very soon, Ukraine, definitely not during this war. But once there is any kind of truce or any kind of stalemate, then Ukraine will join. So it should have managed it diplomatically. I know it's not easy, but don't forget, when Russia, the Soviet Union, fired missiles in Cuba, which is very close to US, I mean, Florida, Maryland, and co. So when you planted yours, the US engaged you diplomatically, and then it was resolved diplomatically. That's the kind of strategy I expected Putin to have backed upon, rather than taking military action. Just all of a sudden like that, you went into another nation territory, and then you started bombarding them, and then
we'll leave it there.
And you have annexed already six. You know,
thank you, Dr. Thomas. Thank you so much. I wish you had more time, and we'll to go further on it. But thank you so much for your contribution this morning. We hope that that both sides learn lessons from this conflict, even going forward, and it ends quickly. Thank you, Dr. Thomas, expert on international relations theory, Lagos State University, for joining us this morning.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Now, we're also learning that the European Union has agreed to an 11th package of sanctions against Russia over its invasion of Ukraine. It's aimed at stopping other countries and companies from circumventing existing measures. The package will restrict the sale of sensitive dual-use goods and technology to third countries that might sell to Russia, to curb the practice of ships loading Russian crude oil or petroleum product at sea. The package bans access to EU ports for vessels that engage in ship-to-ship transfer if there is cause to pause to suspect the cargo was Russian originated. The package adds a further 71 people and 23, that is 33 entities, to those banned from the EU and subject to EU asset freezes for involvement in the illegal deportation of Ukrainian children to Russia. It also extends suspension of EU broadcasting licenses of 5 Russian state-controlled media outlets. Now, Ini John Mekwa, our business correspondent, is joining us on the program this morning to give us further clarity on how the world of business is affected by the conflict in Ukraine and vice versa. The international Ukraine. Ini, good morning.
Good morning.
Okay, so I start over. The International Ukraine Recovery Conference in the UK.
Yeah, so it started yesterday. I think you've been talking a whole lot about it. Yes. I think it's supposed to end today. And we see that UK is trying to galvanize help for Ukraine's reconstruction. It seems everybody's trying to do this one way or the other. Remember, I think last week or earlier this week, we did talk about the US-Ukrainian Act.
Yes.
Remember that they have an act now that we call REPO, and you talked about all of that. So this time it's the United Kingdom, and they're trying to get together about 400 companies, 1,000 foreign dignitaries, 61 countries involved, captains of industry, global investors, to find a way to invest in Ukraine and provide finance and non-finance aid to help. Now, the interesting thing about this, they're aiming for $3 billion in 3 years that they're supposed to give to Ukraine. Okay. And the UK is promising to contribute an initial £20 million, this. And then so far, UK has given about 347 million in aid to Ukraine. But the problem is, how do you help people when your country is also in dire need of help? because the UK now is in the brink of, you know, the threat of recession.
Okay.
The issue of cost of living is there, and they keep increasing interest rates. That means that a lot of people pay mortgages, and it's affecting them. And they're saying that the housing sector might be the area to push the economy to recession. And we're seeing UK promising £20 million. So, you know, some Britons are like, well, can you look inwards first?
How the House of Commons taken it? Because they're really in support of Ukraine.
Yes, they are.
For one thing, yeah.
For one thing, but the people are also feeling the pinch, you know, which of course you expect the opposition, you know, to wake up all up to this. And that's what is happening actually, because, I mean, we do have our own problems. Inflation, it seems to be going down, but it's still high compared to the target. And GDP is not looking so attractive anyway. I mean, the other time they were just a marginal growth on their economy. Because of the cost of living, they still have to look for buffers for energy costs and all of that. And you still want to do this. I mean, it's a noble act. But I mean,
yes, obviously. They call it taking care of number one before you take care of number two, someone else. But thank you so much, Ini. This conversation continues tomorrow.
Sure.
Maybe not the same topics, but obviously in the same region. Thanks, Ini.
Thank you.
Ini John Mekwa. Now, the International Olympic Committee has said that it is still has enough time to decide whether Russia and Belarusian athletes will participate in the next year's Olympics in Paris. That's where we leave it for this edition of our special coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay. Thank you so much for watching. Do join us again tomorrow for a fresh edition. Have a good day and see you next time.